landscape has changed from what it has been over the last 20 years. The counterterrorism landscape is changing continually now, I think, and it will continue to change. And as a community, we're having to grapple with whether the tools that we have are fit for purpose to deal with these changes, and if we can carry over some of these cross-jurisdictional and multi-stakeholder approaches that we've developed into what will be new challenges, new threat spectrum, whether it's applicable to the online space in the same way. It certainly is complicated by the transnational nature of the online space, on the way that there are different interpretations of what is terrorism, what the legal parameters for dealing with terrorism are in this context online, and the challenging nature of what is maybe lawful but is awful in content, and how that can reduce people's resilience to violent extremism. So I think we're going to have a discussion here today amongst all of my excellent colleagues about what we can do to see about how to handle terrorist-operated content in these spaces, as well as this gray borderline content, and how can we approach that in all different online spaces. So I'm going to hand first to our colleague, Adam Hadley, who is the founder and executive director of Tech Against Terrorism.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, for organising today's side event at UN Counterterrorism Week, and of course UNCTED, UNOCT, and the government of the US for its sponsorship. Those of you who've attended other events at the UN this week would probably have heard a fair number of times me mentioning terrorist-operated websites, and there's good reason for this. In this area, in terms of tackling the terrorist use of the internet, it's right and proper that we focus on emerging technologies and the ways in which terrorists are experimenting with new technologies to get their message out there and to meet their strategic objectives. But it's really important, in our view, at Tech Against Terrorism, not to neglect old technologies. It's important not to neglect how terrorists are experimenting across the entire spectrum. An area of significant concern we have is so-called terrorist-operated websites. Those of you old enough to remember would know that in the early 2000s, if not slightly before then, Al-Qaeda and other groups set up their own websites almost with impunity. And potentially a combination of state activity and the creation of social media meant that many of these terrorist-operated websites sort of fell out of use or were taken down. Unfortunately, what we've found over the past few years is that terrorist organizations from right across the spectrum, violent Islamist extremist organizations, neo-Nazi, you name it, have started to go back to terrorist-operated websites. And many of these services are freely accessible. It makes it quite hard to report on as well. I note that this event is being live streamed, and I'd imagine some terrorists are watching it, so we're not going to go into too much detail. But many of these services, if you know the name, can be easily found. It makes it very hard to discuss, because even naming one of these sites, therefore, makes it very easy for anyone to find them. And given that it's almost impossible to have these sites removed, we're really concerned about this. But yeah, it makes it difficult to communicate. It makes it difficult to explain the threat, because we can't actually talk about any of these sites publicly. So in our view, terrorist-operated websites undermine pretty much all global efforts to counter terrorist content and activity online. Why is this? They're easily accessible, huge databases of material, and, well, actually a lot of the material we're talking about is not only terrorist content, but also manuals about how to conduct attacks. Some of them also have forums and ways for people to communicate with one another. So loads of downloadable, readily accessible content. Reduces reliance on big tech and smaller platforms as well. So in a sense, you could argue that this is a success in that we've moved terrorist activity away from big tech and smaller platforms. But the problem we now have, well, it's a big headache, because as far as we're aware, there's no consensus, international norms about how to deal with the infrastructure there. And as ever in our work at Tech Against Terrorism, the full title of Tech Against Terrorism is Tackling the Terrorist Use of the Internet Whilst Respecting Human Rights. There are serious concerns about removal and takedown at the infrastructure layer. There are legitimate concerns about state actors abusing counterterrorism to take down vast swathes of the internet. So there's normative complexity here, because, of course, we don't want to be causing more harm than good by tackling a number of terrorist-operated websites. We don't want to create precedent for states to remove parts of the internet. Nevertheless, we feel that it is negligent of the counterterrorism community not to be focusing on this. So we've found that, we're aware of at least 250 terrorist-operated websites, by which we mean websites that are highly likely owned, operated, paid for by designated terrorist organizations. So we're not talking about kind of a broad spectrum of organizations here. We are literally talking about ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, for example, has a wonderful time publishing its own material through its own terrorist-operated website. We've had it removed 5 times now. It's back up again. Tackling TOWs is a significant challenge. They are difficult to disrupt because of the complex legal and jurisdictional backdrop. There's a lack of accountability and consensus. It's very easy to set up new ones. There's also quite a lot of free services that protect terrorist-operated websites. I won't name it, but there's a famous content distribution network that protects most terrorist-operated websites, which really complicates any investigation that might be required. It is a problem, I believe, that we need to address as an international community. There's a lot of discussion about the theory of terrorist use of the internet, and lots of kind of interesting conceptual discussions. But actually, this is a really concrete problem that, in principle, is pretty easy to fix. There are around 250 of these sites. All it really needs is a concerted effort to carry out some investigation, to reach out to domain name registrars, one particular content distribution network or DDoS protection provider, and also the major hosts. So in theory, this is a solvable problem, but in practice is alarmingly difficult to galvanize activity, despite the fact that it's such a apparently simple thing to do. So of the 250 or 60 TOWs that we're aware of, about 150 are connected to designated violent extremist organizations. About 120 are connected to extreme far-right or right-wing domains. Our efforts at Tech Against Terrorism have so far resulted in around 50 being removed, but often they just pop up again with a new domain name. So it's slightly kind of Pyrrhic victory. One major example of this is AQAP's primary TOW, which I won't name, has been disrupted by us 5 times since December 2022, and also a number of pro-IS TOWs, one of which contained 2 terabytes of terrorist material, which is, it's quite a lot, I suggest. So overall, our actions against TOWs have included sending abuse reports to domain registrars, trying to reach out to a number of domain hosts to alert them to the possibility of them hosting sites. The point to stress here is, unlike the removal of terrorist content, which is controversial in some jurisdictions, the legal basis for removal of terrorist-operated websites is slightly different. And this is something that can take some time to explain to stakeholders. It's our belief, certainly our understanding of US law, is that if a site is likely owned or operated or paid for by a designated terrorist organization, then there's a pretty clear-cut argument for having it removed. And that's got nothing to do with the content itself, but rather the provenance of how it's been set up. So in theory, that makes it slightly easier to have an intervention. But in practice, it's quite hard to convince companies to do much about this, despite the fact that many of them have literally received money from designated terrorist organizations. So we'd be really keen to establish relationships potentially with FATF and others, because as far as we're concerned, this is obviously criminal activity and needs to stop as soon as possible. So the kind of 4 areas that we look at are, firstly, search engines, having these terrorist-operated websites delisted from search engines. Then writing a pretty comprehensive threat analysis report and sending that to domain registrars, DNS registries. So we have a template that's available on our site as well, because we believe it's important to provide clear legal analytical basis for these takedown removals. Thirdly, there's one particular CDN that's responsible for supporting a lot of TOWs, and there are a number of hosting providers. But because of this sort of intermediary CDN, it's very difficult for us to know where these sites are being hosted. And obviously, we don't have nation-state level signals intelligence capabilities, so we don't actually know where these sites are hosted. So it's very hard to report these because ultimately we don't know the source of them. So in terms of our recommendations, we are hoping that through a series of events this week at the UN Counterterrorism Week, we've raised the threat or awareness of the threat of terrorist-operated websites. We believe there's a need to build consensus around practically what can be done and coordinating activity, but also encouraging improved international norms regarding the infrastructure layer. We also would like to improve sort of interfaces with internet infrastructure services, and we'll call many of these services to come to the table to discuss this. The Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism, the GIFCT, and Erin is here on my left. The GIFCT provides one great way for tech platforms of all sizes to engage with the international community. So certainly I would recommend infrastructure providers to join the GIFCT or to apply. So yeah, that draws to a close my comments here, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam. I think it's really, we tried to build